Thank you very much. So our last speaker, Dan Spencer, is homegrown, currently finishing his PhD on the development of English artillery in the 15th century under the direction of Professor Anniv. He will soon have an article on the 1428 expedition to France published in the Journal of Medieval Military History. And Dan is also heavily involved in the anniversary of the Battle of Agincourt, participating in the creation of an online course on Agincourt, and running the beautiful Agincourt 600 website.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Remy. Thank you. Okay, so I'm going back into the early 15th century for this paper. Okay. On 22nd September 1415, the defenders of Harfleur were forced to surrender their town. They had endured a 6-week siege, but were no longer able to resist an English army led in person by Henry V. According to the author of the Gesta Henrici Quinti, they feared being attacked by assault, despaired of being relieved by a French army, and had been sorely troubled by the scourge of the stones fired by the English guns. The siege of Harfleur was the first time that an English army made extensive use of gunpowder artillery in offensive warfare against an urban settlement. Guns were subsequently to play an important role in the conquest of Normandy and in future campaigns in France. Now, the use of firearms in the reign of Henry V has for a long time been recognised as being significant, but historians have been divided on its impact. So Sir Charles Oman, writing as long ago as 1885, characterises the siege of Harfleur as one of the rare triumphs of artillery in this age, a positive view which has been shared by many subsequent writers. Clifford Rogers took a slightly different view in an article in 1993 in which he argued that Henry's intentions were simply to counter the artillery of the defenders as opposed to reducing the defences of the settlement itself. So in my paper today, I will argue that the reign of Henry V represents a significant turning point in the use of gunpowder artillery on land. So I would do this by beginning by examining the context of the early history of English firearms, particularly during the reign of his father, Henry IV. I will then look at the 1415 campaign and the siege of Harfleur before moving on to Henry's subsequent campaigns in Normandy. I'll then conclude this paper by examining the reasons why I believe gunpowder artillery assumed a greater prominence in his reign. So the earliest recorded use of guns during the English expedition occurred in August 1346 at the Battle of Crecy. These weapons were supplied to Edward III by the keeper of the Privy Wardrobe, an office that's been discussed by Malcolm and Tom in their papers, by a Robert of Maidenhall, an official responsible for the production and storage of arms and armour at the Tower of London. This appears to be an isolated experiment, however, as there is no evidence of their use on the battlefield again by the English before the middle years of the 15th century. Instead, guns were used exclusively in siege warfare as both offensive and defensive weapons, as with the siege of Calais, which commenced in September 1346. Following the Battle of Crecy on the 1st September, Edward III ordered the delivery of 10 guns with lead shot, gunpowder, sulphur and saltpetre to be transported to the besieging army outside the town. Yet for much of the reign of Edward III, guns were only produced in small quantities and were mainly supplied for the furnishing of royal castles, alongside additional artillery such as bolt-throwing springles. An increase in the number of firearms produced by the Crown did occur under his grandson's successor, Richard II, but these weapons remained generally small in size and were primarily used in a defensive as opposed to offensive role. Now, I would contend that this change in the reign of Henry IV, with the emergence of new large types of guns which were regularly deployed in siege warfare. Henry Bolingbroke took a personal interest in firearms, perhaps as a result of the experiences on crusade in Lithuania, and he changed the organisation of the Royal Artillery, with new officials appointed to work alongside the Privy Wardrobe in the production of guns. And judging by their names, at least some of these officials were of German or Dutch origin. It's likely that these men were responsible for construction of the new large guns, which were later referred to as bombards, which fired heavy gunstones capable of breaking down fortifications and which were given their own individual names. These weapons were first utilised during the suppression of the rebellion led by Henry Percy, Earl of Northumberland, in 1405, during the sieges of Warkwood and Berwick castles. According to a report sent to the Royal Council, the king had summoned the garrison of Warkwood Castle to surrender, but as the latter were well provisioned, they had refused. Henry responded by attacking the castle with guns, which prompted the garrison to quickly surrender on the 1st of July. Similarly, the chronicler Thomas Walsingham stated that the garrison at Berwick Castle surrendered after a large gun had been fired at them, which demolished part of one of the towers, and so frightened the garrison that they preferred voluntarily to expose themselves to the king's swords rather than to wait for a second firing. They were also later deployed in combating the rebels of Owen Glendower in Wales, with the young prince, Henry of Monmouth, gaining first-hand experience of gunpowder artillery in the sieges of Aberystwyth and Harlech castles. Extensive preparations were made for these sieges, with large sums of money spent on procuring a large artillery train. Well equipped with gunpowder and ammunition, this was undoubtedly intended to be showcases to demonstrate English might. Instead, rather embarrassingly for the English, the beleaguered Welsh garrisons were able to put up a prolonged and determined resistance. So in both sieges, gunpowder artillery was ineffectual against the walls of these castles. Despite the presence of the large prestigious guns and substantial quantities of gunpowder, the garrisons instead starved into surrender. A number of these weapons also ruptured under the strain of firing, with a great bronze gun called Messenger, weighing £4,500, breaking at the siege of Aberystwyth Castle, whereas an even heavier iron gun, their king's daughter, of £5,500, broke at the siege of Harlech Castle. Perhaps surprisingly, considering this rather negative experience, Henry of Monmouth was not put off using firearms, and in fact appears to have appreciated they were useful weapons of war. Although guns were by no means a guarantee of success in siege warfare, they were powerful and prestigious weapons, which at least had the potential to speed up the course of sieges. Along with being loud and destructive, qualities I'm sure he appreciated. And this explains why Henry made extensive use of gunpowder artillery in his war at France after becoming king in 1413. Henry announced his intention to lead an army to France in the Parliament of November 1414, although preparations for the expedition had been in progress since the previous year. Artillery that had formerly been used in Wales was transported back to England, with a commission given to a John Sprunge and John Looth in September 1413 to take horses, oxen, waggons and carts for the carriage of guns from Bristol to London. And in 1414, efforts were made to increase the production of guns in the Tower of London, with the King's smith, William at Merch, appointed to hire smiths, and £18,000 of iron was acquired for the forging of wrought iron guns. The tower also served as a storage area for the ordnance, with saltpetre and sulphur, almost certainly imported from abroad, sent there. Gunmaking was primarily concentrated at London, although a merchant of Bristol, John Stevens, was paid over £100 for his expenses in overseeing the construction of a large iron gun for the use of the king. It is clear that this was intended to be a campaign of conquest, as opposed to a chevauchée or mounted raid into France, from the word go. Henry was therefore keen to ensure they had the best qualified professionals to construct, maintain and operate a powerful artillery train. It was for this reason that he commissioned a German or Dutch knight, William van Jussendorn, to locate master gunners and gunpowder, most likely from the Low Countries, an industrialised region well known for the production of guns since the late 14th century. Jussendorn's efforts appear to have borne fruit, as in addition to Gerard Sprunge, 29 master gunners and 58 other gunners were retained for the expedition in 1415, many of whom again appear to have been of German or Dutch origin. Henry's predecessors had also employed foreign specialists from the continent, but this was the first time they were recruited in large numbers. Other professionals hired for the King's Ordnance included 100 masons, 120 carpenters, 40 smiths and 60 carters. These preparations were on a much greater scale than those of previous expeditions, and this can be illustrated alone by the purchase of as many as 10,000 gunstones in October 1414, and this appears to have prompted the king to change the organisation of the Royal Artillery, with Nicholas Murbury appointed as the first Master of the Ordnance on 22nd September 1414. This new office at first coexisted with the Privy Wardrobe, but by the end of Henry's reign had become solely responsible for the provision and storage of ordnance. Sadly, it's not possible to determine the total number of guns or other equipment provided for the expedition, as the accounts do not survive. And in fact, the earliest one we have of the 15th century is the 1428 expedition to France that Remy mentioned earlier. However, we do have some idea of the artillery available to Henry V for the campaign, as Malcolm mentioned his talk earlier today, as we have the accounts of Gerald Sprunge, which were enrolled in the Foreign Account Roll for 1415, which revealed that at the beginning of his reign, he had at least 6 large and 20 small guns, located in the Tower of London, Wells and elsewhere, and these weapons were given their own individual names, such as Bristol, God's Grace and George. The expedition set sail for Normandy on 11th August, and the siege of Harfleur began 7 days later. Artillery played an important role in the siege of the town, as can be seen in the detailed account given in the Gesta Henrici Quinti. According to the author of the Gesta, Henry positioned his guns and mechanical artillery close to the walls and towers of Harfleur. The English artillery was then able to bombard the town in relative safety, as they were protected by large wooden screens and trenches, which they had dug. The French, however, were also well equipped with firearms, and in front of their gates they had constructed a new specialised form of fortification known as a bulwark. These were small forts constructed out of wood and earth with embrasures for the use of guns and other missile weapons. And this appears to be the first time that the English encountered this new type of artillery fortification, which they soon adopted for their own use. Harfleur was besieged for 6 weeks, with the defenders only surrendering on terms after the main bulwark had been captured. The English bombardment clearly caused significant damage, as can be seen by the repairs carried out to the defences of the town after its capture on the 22nd September, with masons, carpenters and labourers, including French prisoners, employed on mending walls, towers and bulwarks. This was not the sole reason for the successful outcome of the siege, however, with the exhaustion of the garrison, failing at the French to relieve the town, and the threat of a storm also being important factors. It's clear, however, that the use of artillery at Harfleur was considered by Henry to be a success, as can be seen by a letter he wrote to the City of the Corporation of London on 22nd September, the same day the town surrendered. And in this document he made specific reference to the strength and position of our cannon in the decision of the inhabitants to surrender. The army's guns were then left behind in the town, along with many of the gunners. And we know from the accounts of Harfleur that Gerard Sprunge commanded 18 master gunners and 18 assistant gunners in the garrison until at least 1420. Gunpowder artillery subsequently played an important role in Henry's second expedition to France in 1417. On the 1st of August, he invaded Normandy with a large army and laid siege to the city of Caen 17 days later. Caen was heavily bombarded by the English artillery before being taken by storm on the 4th of September, with the garrison at the castle surrendering 3 days later. Chronicle accounts make clear that artillery played an important role in the successful outcome of the siege, with Thomas Walsingham stating that the king battered the castle with such heavy gunfire that the garrison thought it was impossible to defend the place. The brutal treatment of the inhabitants persuaded a number of other settlements in Lower Normandy to quickly surrender, such as Argentan and Alençon, although it took a 2-month siege for Falaise to be captured. The heavy expenditure of gunpowder during these sieges meant that it was necessary for further munitions to be sent from England to France. In 1418, large quantities of supplies were transported from Southampton to Caen, including 93 barrels of saltpetre and 17 barrels of gunpowder. Regular payments also occurred throughout the year for the construction of guns at Tower Hill by the smith John Matthew, together with other ordnance which are shipped from Winchelsea to Caen. The effective deployment of guns also required large quantities of other material and animals, and this is revealed by an entry on the patent roll for the 10th of February, which was directed to John Looth, the clerk of the works of the King's Ordnance. Looth was directed to take workers for the construction of equipment for guns, including 300 large purveyors, I think that's how you pronounce it, which were large wooden shields used to protect the guns, 7,000 tampons or wedges used to separate the powder from the shot in the gun, 7,000 gunstones, 12 large carts, together with halters and other items, for 100 oxen and 320 horses to draw the same. So it's quite substantial quantities of equipment. Further towns and castles in Lower Normandy were captured in 1418, including Avranches and Cherbourg. Henry then invested the capital of Normandy, Rouen, on 29th July, and after a siege of 24 weeks, the city was starved as opposed to bombarded into surrender. Now, considering the prominent role that gunpowder artillery had played in the capture of other settlements in Normandy, such as Harfleur and Caen, his decision not to employ guns on this occasion would appear to be somewhat strange. Yet, as noted by Agincourt, the use of firearms did have a great significant drawback in that the damage they caused could be very expensive to repair, and which made it rather difficult to defend these places once you had actually captured them. And Henry was undoubtedly keen to take possession of this city, the most important in the duchy, without destroying it in the process. And this strategy was made possible as a result of previous English victories, such as at Agincourt, and the disarray of his divided French opponents, which meant that the besiegers faced little prospect of being driven away by a French army of relief. And in the following year, military operations were aimed at consolidating English control of Normandy. Additional ordnance was sent over to France from England, with guns forged at the Tower of London, including the earliest recorded mention of a type of gun known as a Fowler. Now, it's likely, at least I believe so anyway, that these small guns had been in existence prior to 1419, but the naming of this particular type of gun shows that it was felt necessary to distinguish between the very large bombards and the very much smaller Fowlers. So we're already, at this very early stage, seeing a process of diversification occurring in gun types. The final years of the reign of Henry V continued to see summer ordnance transported from England to support the war effort in France. In February 1420, John Looth was again instructed to hire artificers for the construction of equipment, including 4 great carts, which were to be drawn by 60 oxen and 24 horses. And in October of the following year, £1,600 of gunpowder was purchased, with a further £8,000 of saltpetre purchased from a merchant of Catalonia. Nevertheless, by the death of Henry V in 1422, it's clear that the division of artillery for the war in France was now mostly carried out in Lancashire in France, as opposed to England. And this is evidenced by a very sharp fall in expenditure by the English exchequer. And this seems to have occurred due to the capture of large quantities of artillery during the conquest of Normandy, and as a result of the king's efforts to construct guns in Lancashire and France itself. Henry's recognition as heir to Charles VI, as a result of the Treaty of Troyes in May 1420, also meant he acquired additional French resources, as well as an alliance with Philip, Duke of Burgundy. So, what were the factors responsible for these changes in the use of gunpowder artillery? Well, in my opinion, I would contend there's 3 main reasons for this. Firstly, the development of large guns during the reign of his father, Henry IV, most likely due to the technological expertise of his foreign gunners. And this was a crucial change which made it possible for the first time for the English to employ guns capable of causing significant damage to fortifications. And the use of guns in the Welsh War, despite their mixed effectiveness, also appears to have made an impression on the future Henry V. Secondly, Henry's extensive use of firearms would not have been possible, or at the least would have been very much more expensive, were it not for a significant decrease in the price of gunpowder. Now, this is a chart which I've compiled from all the evidence in the 15th century that I've been able to gather. Now, it needs to be used with a degree of caution, as the surviving evidence is very fragmentary, so certain periods there's much more evidence than others. But what I would contend is, it shows that there was a very significant decrease in the price of gunpowder in the early years of the 15th century. And even though after that point the price fluctuated quite a lot, it never reached the height of the 14th century. So it went from being in the late 14th century from about 12 to 24 pence a pound to being as little as 5 pence a pound by 1417. And this made it much more affordable to acquire and use large quantities of gunpowder in siege warfare. Thirdly, Henry V's strategy of conquest in France meant the use of gunpowder artillery on a large scale was essential. Without the use of firearms, it's hard to imagine the Duchy of Normandy could have been conquered as quickly as it was. I think it's also important to note, however, that we shouldn't overstate the power and effectiveness of these early firearms. The employment of guns was by no means a guarantee of success in capturing enemy settlements. As with the siege of Harfleur, other factors often came into play. Yet they could be useful in sufficiently damaging fortifications to make an attempt at storming possible, or to persuade the defenders to surrender. I would therefore contend that the reign of Henry V can be seen as representing a turning point in the use of guns by English monarchs. Thank you for listening.